Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Coffee with Thorben. And yeah, it's great to have you. It's great to have another Friday afternoon activity and stream. And let me quickly turn this off. I'm hearing myself. Okay. Yeah, great to have you for another virtual coffee. I hope you had a great week and that you're now ready to dive into some Hibernate topics and then maybe call it a week and enjoy the weekend. Yeah, welcome to everyone in the chat. Hi Saga, hi Nada, Bazu, hi Adam, hi Gokirat. Yeah, great to see you everyone. You could do me a favor. I would like to learn a little bit more about where you're actually coming from and what are your time zones. So maybe you can post that in the chat so that I get a better feeling of for which time zones the current time is actually a great fit. I mean, I decided to do these streams at 3 p.m. my time, mostly because it's a great time for my own schedule. Fits pretty well into the Friday, but if we see that it's not that great of a time for most of the viewers, then we might change that in the future. So let's see. Yeah, quite a lot of people from India here. That's great. Okay, then let's dive into this week's topic. As always, you can find additional resources for this stream in at the link at the bottom of the screen here. If you visit torbenjansen.com/live, you end up here. And as you can see, there's a post for today's stream. And down here, you can find all the other streams that we did so far. That page gets automatically updated when we are doing another stream. You can find all the replays here, which usually stay on YouTube if nothing goes wrong. And yeah, so if you want to dive deeper into any of the things we discuss here or check older streams, please visit torbenjansen.com/live. Oh, and I see quite a few responses in the chat. That's awesome. So we have India, which is 4.5 hours ahead of me. So that is, what is that? 7:30 p.m. north of Syria, 4 p.m., just 1 hour ahead. Belfast, UK, 1 hour earlier. And Govind from India, hi. So that's probably also 5.5 hours ahead. Okay, looks like that we get quite a broad range of locations with the current time. Probably a bit hard for people in North or South America to attend, but well, that's just how it is with online live streams, right? So okay, let's get into today's topic. So I want to talk about natural and surrogate primary keys. Why do I want to talk about that? Well, first of all, because there were questions about it. And then because I get quite often asked about these things on my email list and on conference talks. Well, at least when I can attend conferences. And so what are natural keys and what are surrogate keys? Natural keys are one or more database columns or entity attributes that by nature identify that object. A typical example would be an ISBN for a book or a social security number for a person. Yeah, these are typical natural keys. Then we have surrogate keys, which are technical IDs. So there you decide, okay, I don't want to use a natural ID because it consists of 7 attributes until it's unique or something like that. Maybe you have the situation that the natural ID might be assigned later on in the life cycle of that object. All of these things can be reasons for surrogate keys. And these are usually generated using a database sequence or an auto-incremented database column. And well, there's always the question, when do you choose which one and how do you actually map them. If you're talking with a typical DBA, then they quite often tell you, well, there is a natural key, why not use it? And well, with JPA and Hibernate, that speaks nothing against using natural IDs. Just try to keep them relatively simple. Please keep in mind that all the columns that are part of the natural key will be part of each and every foreign key reference. That all parts of the primary key will be part of will be used by the caching mechanism that you use on different levels of your application. So within Hibernate as the first level cache and persistence context, for second level caching, and all these kind of things. So they are better try to keep them as simple as possible. But a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Let's now get into the IDE. So here with Hibernate, you have actually pretty good support for natural IDs. With JPA, there is basically no support at all, which means you can map your primary key as standard entity attribute. And then you can use it like this. You just tell that the ID is the primary key, and you treat it as a natural ID by setting it from the outside when you're persisting a new object. Nothing special of support needed here. That just works out of the box. Which is a little bit unfortunate because we see it quite often that we have a surrogate, which means a technical primary key, because it's easier to work with, it's more efficient in caching and all these kind of things. But we still have the surrogate key, the natural primary key, which is used for all kinds of use cases. Let's say you go into a physical bookstore and you ask for a specific book, then the employee there will most likely ask you for the ISBN number, totally independent of if the ISBN number is used as the primary key within their internal system or not. They can use the ISBN as a key to search for something. And we can do the same with Hibernate. Hibernate adds proprietary support for natural IDs, and there you just define one or more attributes and annotate them with natural ID. So we are then not using them as a primary key because we set this up here as our primary key. So this is just an additional ID that we can then use in our use cases. And Hibernate provides a proprietary API that makes working with these IDs a little bit easier. So with plain JPA, you would write your own database query that selects a book based on the provided ISBN number, which isn't a big deal. It's a pretty simple query. We can write that in a minute or two. But Hibernate's support goes one or two steps further. So what can we do here? We can get the Hibernate session. As I said, it's a proprietary Hibernate feature, so it's not supported by JPA's entity manager. We get Hibernate session, and there we have the method by natural ID, and there we can define what kind of object, kind of entity object we want to fetch by its natural ID. And then we can use the using method for each part of the natural ID. So in this case, it's pretty simple. The natural ID of my book entity consists of one attribute, which is the ISBN. So I just call using, reference the ISBN attribute, provide the value of that ISBN, and call the load method. Let's run this test and take a look what happens internally. So in the meantime, I take another look at the chat. Yeah, hi Nirav, hi Martin, someone from Bangalore, India, someone from Stuttgart. Zaga asked, in terms of performance, does it matter when we choose natural or surrogate keys? Does Hibernate check these natural key extra select call? Yeah, I will show that in a second. From a database point of view, as long as your natural ID is not too complex, and as long as your database can cache that one efficiently, there is actually no performance difference. So depending on the database system that you are using and depending on the complexity of your natural ID, you should check the indexing capabilities of your database. If you're working with a DBA on your project, maybe talk with them, ask them about that. But in general, a natural ID provides on the database level the same performance as a surrogate key. If there's a difference, then it's because of defining a key over multiple database columns, or because the data type of that key is not as efficiently cacheable as it would be the case for a surrogate key. But it's not directly related to being a natural ID. So let's take a look at the log. So here, that was the code that we executed. We told Hibernate, please get me the book with the provided ISBN. And then we see two select statements in our log file. We see the statement here, where Hibernate selects the ID of the book for the provided natural ID. And then we see another select statement that fetches the book by its primary key, by its ID. So when you see that for the first time, you probably ask yourself, what the heck is going on here, right? Why does Hibernate need to execute two queries? That looks pretty inefficient, but it actually isn't that bad. So what is Hibernate doing here? Hibernate first tries to resolve the natural ID, the one that we have here, against an internal cache of natural ID to primary key mappings. And only if that entry isn't there, so if Hibernate doesn't know that natural ID, it executes this query here to select the primary key value for that natural ID. After that, that key pair is put into the cache, and you will not need to execute it again, that query again, until that entry gets removed from the cache. And then we have the second query, that one down here, where Hibernate gets the book by its primary key. So what Hibernate is doing there, Hibernate resolves the primary key value first against the first level cache, and then against the second level cache if it's configured. And after that, it resolves it against the database. So Hibernate there uses the typical approach that it, for example, also uses if you're calling the entity manager find method with a primary key. That also means that if you already fetched that entity, if that book entity would be managed already, then Hibernate wouldn't execute the second query. So here the approach might look a little bit inefficient when we execute it for the first time, but that's just because we have a newly started system where all caches are empty. And that gets way more efficient over time. So if you have a natural ID like we have here that just consists of one attribute, that's actually a shortcut. So this approach up here works for all kinds of natural IDs. They can be as complex as you want to design them. So we could do here, you could say the title, for example, if that one would also be part of the natural ID, then we could just call the using method again and do that for each and every element of the natural ID. If it's just one element, then we can provide it to the load method directly. So skip the call of the using method up here. And then Hibernate does actually the same. And now don't be surprised, we will resolve the natural ID against the database again. So we again have two queries here, one to get the primary key and one then to get the book entity, because well, when we run the second test, we actually start up a totally new environment. So we start up a new VM with a newly installed entity manager and everything. So the whole context again is empty. Okay, let's take another look at the chat. Yeah, hi Kofi. Oh, from Togo, nice. Hi Tepco, great to see you again. And then we have a question from Facebook, maybe out of scope. to use Elasticsearch, which one is better approach between natural and surrogate? So if you're using Elasticsearch, well, you probably want to integrate it via Hibernate search, right? Then you would use I'm pretty sure you would use the primary key internally. So there, the natural ID wouldn't make any difference. Attribute that you might include in Hibernate search or not, but besides that, the resolution between these two data stores, the relational database and and Elasticsearch, you would do via primary key anyways. Yeah, Zaga, you're right. Every property that you store in Elasticsearch can be indexed, and the indexing of IDs is actually kind of not that good of approach. But what Hibernate does with this Hibernate search integration is it stores the records in some kind of full text search engine. And it stores there all the properties and the primary key, and it puts indexes on, most of the times you put the index on all columns except of the primary key. And then you do a full text search, Hibernate gets back the primary key value of that object and then goes to the relational database to fetch the entity with that primary key from there, which nicely combines both worlds into one system. And the nice thing there about Hibernate search is that it automatically keeps both data stores up to date. So if you update a column that is, or an entity attribute that is also stored in your full text search engine index, then Hibernate makes sure to send the update statement to your relational database, but also to update your full text search index. And they are then depending on the update configuration that you put into Hibernate search. Okay, so this was Hibernate's proprietary support for natural IDs if you don't make them a primary key. If you make them a primary key, then, well, it's just something then it would just be a primary key attribute without any additional generated value annotations up here. So let's take another look at surrogate keys and talk about a few pitfalls there. So here we have an author entity with an ID, with a surrogate primary key, and then we have a generated value annotation here that tells Hibernate to use, in this case, a sequence to generate the primary key value. So based on the JPA spec, we now need a generator annotation here if we want to use the sequence, author sequence. What we see here is we have a generator with that name, and then we have a sequence generator annotation where we have that name again, and then we have the sequence name. That's pretty annoying. With Hibernate 5, you can, I think it's with Hibernate 5.2, 5.2 or 5.3, you can just skip the sequence generator annotation, and Hibernate will generate that one internally. But then you're no longer JPA compliant. So what happens here is, if we now persist in this case a set of entities, here I'm persisting 20 author entities, then we can see here that we have a bunch of inside statements. And what's quite interesting, up here we only have 2 select statements on the database sequence. That is because Hibernate uses an optimization that we discuss in great detail in the Hibernate performance tuning course that is based on the allocation size here of the sequence generator. That one is 50 by default. So what Hibernate does there is it gets a value from that sequence and then internally increments it 49 times and before it selects another value from that sequence. And because the sequence itself gets incremented in steps of 50, we can be sure that these 49 values that Hibernate generated are actually unique. Nobody else will generate these. And that drastically reduces the number of statements that are sent to the database. As you can see, we just have 2 statements on the author sequence. These are 2 sequences because Hibernate selects a value from that sequence and then uses the first one for that author entity that gets persisted later. And as soon as Hibernate starts using values from one batch of primary key values, it automatically selects the next batch so that the cache is always filled with new primary key values. So instead of having 50 select statements that get a value from the author sequence, we only have 2. And then, of course, we have an SQL insert statement for each and every entity we persist here. And that is pretty nice because we can, I will probably see that here. This approach enables Hibernate to separate the generation of the primary key values from the execution of the SQL insert statements. So yeah, we don't see that too well here, but when we see there are 82 milliseconds difference there. So what Hibernate did was, when we called the persist method, Hibernate used the sequence values to initialize the primary key attribute. And all these insert statements were executed when we, where's my test case here, when we committed the transaction, because before that it wasn't necessary to persist the entity. So Hibernate tries to delay the execution of the SQL insert statements as long as possible, so that if we change anything on these entities, we don't need to execute another update statement. And for example, we can use things like JDBC batching to further improve the performance of groups of SQL insert statements. The second approach that you can use to create to model surrogate primary key values is the identity strategy. That one uses an auto-incremented database cover. That is pretty popular with DBAs because, well, on the database level, it provides good performance and they don't need to manage an additional sequence. So less work, about the same performance. With Hibernate, that's not exactly the case. The issue here is that Hibernate needs the primary key value when we persist a new entity, because then Hibernate needs to store that entity object in its internal data structures. And these are quite often some kinds of maps. And there Hibernate needs the primary key value as part of the index. So Hibernate is forced to get a primary key value when we are persisting the object. And that means that Hibernate immediately executes the SQL insert statement. And that might sound like a minor difference, but it means that you can't benefit from JDBC batching. That means that Hibernate can't delay the execution of insert statements. It just automatically writes the statement to the database. And what you can see here is we execute an insert statement where the primary key value, the ID, isn't mentioned because that one is provided by the database. And the database then returns the primary key value, which Hibernate uses to store the object in its internal data structure. So yeah, from a Hibernate performance point of view, the identity strategy is okay, but not as good as the sequence. So if you have the chance, then always use a database sequence. And then there's theoretically also the table strategy, which I didn't mention here because it's a legacy strategy. It has horrible performance. The idea there is that we have a database table where we have one record for each primary key that we need to generate. Let's say we have the author ID. There's one record, and Hibernate uses select and update statements and database logs to basically simulate a database sequence. That was a needed fallback approach back in the days when we had databases that didn't support sequences and also didn't support auto-incremented columns. That's no longer the case. I'm not familiar with any database that doesn't support any of these two. I mean, even MySQL supports the auto-incremented database column, the auto-incremented column. And all other databases usually support sequences, and most of them support sequences and auto-incremented columns. So no need to use generation type table. If you use it in any of your projects, please take a look at it and remove it. It's really a bad idea from a performance point of view. And yeah, use identity or sequence instead. Sequence, the recommended approach for all databases except MySQL, and MySQL doesn't support sequences, and there you should use an auto-incremented column instead. Okay, that would be the quick rundown of the surrogate versus natural ID part for today's stream. Do you have any questions about that? So Nirav asks, what happens next once table runs out of auto-incremented keys? Well, that usually doesn't happen. So an auto-incremented key is just that the database gets the highest value in that specific column, increments it by 1, and returns the value. So the only issue in which you can get there is that you insert more records than you can store in the data type used for your primary key value. And then you will most likely have an overflow and start with a negative value again. But that's something that you would need to check in your database documentation. But in general, I've never seen that this had become an issue. Yeah, as long as you use along your Java word and a corresponding number type in your database, you can be pretty sure that you don't run out of values in an auto-incremented for your auto-incremented value. So we have used that in projects where we had tables that contained several gigabytes of data. So we're talking about several hundred gigabytes of data in a table, and we ran into lots of different performance issues. But problems with the auto-incremented database columns weren't one of them. So you don't need to worry about that. Yeah, let me quickly summarize and point out when you should use which approach. So natural IDs are in general a great idea if you can ensure that your natural ID is always available when you persist a new object, and if it consists of 1, 2, maybe 3 columns, but even 3 is, from my personal opinion, already be too much for natural ID. If you can map that key to 1 or 2 database columns, natural IDs work pretty well. They have the benefit that you can set them when you're instantiating a new entity object. So they are always set. There's no additional mechanism in Hibernate required to get them. You can easily implement your equals and hashcode methods. In all these cases, natural IDs are great. Please double check the data type that you then need to use for your natural ID. Depending on your database and the format of your natural ID, strings, for example, can be problematic from a performance point of view, from the indexing point of view. But that is something that you would need to double check with your DBA or in your database documentation. And in all the cases where you either don't have a set of columns that uniquely identify a record, or where that means that your key gets really complex, I recommend using a surrogate key, and there I recommend using database sequences. Or if that's not supported because you're using MySQL database, then I would recommend using the identity column. So Hopcroft asks, which mechanism is, in your opinion, best for reading UUID? So UUID as a primary key, that is incredibly simple. You can change the data type here to UUID, and then you just use a generated value annotation. Make sure that's a Java util UUID, and then Hibernate automatically generates the primary key value for you. Let me check. I've an example here somewhere. There. So there's a specification for UUIDs, and in that specification, there are 4 different ways defined how to correctly generate UUID values. Hibernate implements 2 of them. Don't ask me which 2 these are. Don't remember that from the top of my head. But if you have specific requirement there, please check the documentation. But in general, if you just use a column of type UUID and annotate it with generated value, that annotation here is totally optional. And then you can easily persist and read new entities, and Hibernate takes care of everything. Yeah, so we now need to replace the database, right? Test case was successful, even if the log doesn't look like that. Let's give it another try. There it is. So here we can see that we now have an insert statement for the author table. And this is the beautiful UUID that Hibernate generated. And this, for example, would be quite a good approach if you're using multiple databases. If you have offline clients, for example, that work with a local database, where you then just need to replicate the data as soon as that offline client goes online, or if you're working with distributed data centers where you have a nightly replication mechanism or something like that. In all these cases, UUIDs are nice because you don't need a single source of truth, so you don't need a single instance that manages the primary key values. Each and every instance can simply generate a UUID, and then you can merge everything into one huge data pool. Yeah, so this is an alternative to the surrogate key of type long that we just used before. Performance of UUIDs as primary keys is pretty good, decent. If you're building a system that's under incredible high load with lots of parallel requests, then the a primary key of type long might perform a little bit better. But for most applications, that's not a relevant performance concern. You can easily handle several hundred users in parallel writing data into your system without having an issue with UUIDs from a performance point of view. And databases can index these columns pretty efficiently. Please double check with your documentation or DBA there. But yeah, nothing to worry about here. Okay. Well then, so much about the primary key mappings. I now want to quickly tell you about a new course that I will be publishing at the end of this month. So in a little bit more than a week, I will start promoting that course, and then we will open the enrollment in the second to last week of this month. And that course will be about Spring Data JPA. If you're on my email list, you already know that I had been working on that course for a while, and that I did a survey about it. And Well, the answers were overwhelmingly clear. Almost 80% of the responses told me that it's more than time to create a course on Spring Data JPA. So I did that, or I'm still in the process of doing that. And here's an outline of what I will be teaching in that course. As I said, it will be available in a little bit more than, in 2 weeks. It will become available in 2 weeks. And we will, of course, talk about configuration and required dependencies in a standard Spring and in a Spring Boot context. We will dive deep into repositories. So we will talk about JPA standard repositories. We will talk about how to customize a repository based on these standard repositories. So how you can pick certain methods from various repository types and create your own base repository out of it. We will talk about composite repositories where you get where you add your own code to a standard repository or these kind of things. And we will, based on that, build a basic application that we then extend further. We add test cases to it. So there we will talk about how do you actually test an application that uses Spring Data JPA and how do you handle a database startup and these kind of things. Oops, there. And then there will, of course, be a huge chapter about querying data. I mean, that's a huge set of features that Spring Data JPA provides. We talk about derived queries, custom queries, modifying queries, query by example, how to change projections, how to use specifications, how to call stored procedures, all these kind of things. Then we, of course, talk about transaction management because, well, how do you want to talk with a database without managing transactions, right? So we make sure that you're familiar with all the nitty-gritty things that you need to know there. Then we will be integrating query DSL, which is a nice approach if you want to define a more complex query. We will take a look at auditing features. So how can you write an audit log with Spring Data JPA? And then we will, of course, also talk about database migration. So that is something I get always asked about. If you've started implementing your application, shipped the first few versions to production, then at some point you need to migrate your database schema and update it. And there we'll be talking about different options as well. Yeah, enough about the course. As I said, it will be available at the end of March. If you are interested in that, then make sure to go to either the link down here, thorbenjansen.com/springdatajpa, or if you are visiting thorbenjansen.com/live, then you find here a short chapter about the new course where you can sign up for a wait list, or if you're already on my email list, you will for sure also hear about that course there. Okay, enough talking about upcoming courses. Let's take a quick look at the stuff that we shared this week. So first of all, there was a post that I published on Tuesday about configuring Spring Data JPA with Spring Boot. So because I'm currently working hard on that course, I decided to repurpose some of that material and create an extensive guide on how to configure Spring Data JPA with Spring Boot. Yes, I know you don't need to configure a lot if you're using it with Spring Boot, but that doesn't mean that you can't adjust the configuration, and sometimes you need to. And you should, of course, also be familiar with the configuration default so that you know what Spring Data JPA is actually doing internally. So yeah, a lot of the stuff that will be part of the course about configuration you can find in this article, and the actual lecture of the course covers even more than what we put here into the article. And then we have had a video about implementing batch jobs with Hibernate. The first video that I recorded in the entire news setup. If you follow my email list, you know that I did a little bit of renovation work during the Christmas and end of year holidays. So We finally have the first video recording that new recording setup live. And there I'm talking about how to fine-tune Hibernate so that it actually works with in the context of a batch job. Okay, enough talking about this week's content. Let's get to there I wanted to go. Let's talk about the question of the week, which is also primary key related. So at the beginning of the week, Gokirat reached out to me on LinkedIn and asked me if I have time to take a look at a question he posted on Stack Overflow. And well, it took me, okay, it's 2 days ago. I think it was 2 or 3 days ago that I got contacted by him. It took me a while. It took me until this morning to take a look at it. But I thought it's an interesting question, and it became the question of the week. So what do we do here? So they want to model a parent-child association where the parent has a composite primary key, so it consists of multiple attributes. One of these attributes is generated by a database sequence. The rest is provided by the client, so set programmatically. How do you do that? Well, you first of all need a class that represents the primary key. You can do that as an embedded ID or as an ID class. They chose to use an ID class, so I stick to that approach. And we have here the parent key, which contains 2 attributes, PA and PB, and then a bunch of getter and setter methods, equals, hashcode, and so on, as required by the JPA specification. And then we have our parent demo entity class. And there we have 2 attributes with the same name, so PA, PB, 2 attributes with the same name, and both of them are annotated with @ID. So that's all you need to do to model your composite primary key. These 2 attributes, PA and PB, stay attributes of that class, that entity class, and Hibernate and every other JPA implementation uses the parent key class to represent the primary key in all internal structures. So that's a so-called shadow class. That means that Hibernate instantiates an object of that class, sets the primary key values there, and uses that internally. For us as a developer, that class is only relevant if we do a find by ID. So, right, because we now have 2 primary key attributes, we need this ID class that's referenced up here. So if you now want to provide any additional mapping information, you need to provide all of them on the entity class, and there I set the generated value annotation with the generic validator generator. That was the mapping that they provided to generate this as a UUID, and we have the string here, and that is all you need to do to define your entity mappings with a combined primary key or composite primary key, where one part of the primary key gets generated by a UUID, by a sequence, by whatever. So that is that. And now there was a second question. They want to have a child. Let's take a look at the. Do we have the child demo here? No. There's the child demo. So then they want to model a child entity that has a primary key that consists of 3 parts. One that's identical to the parent and 2 child-specific attributes. And the question there was, how can we model it that we automatically reuse the primary key of the parent? Unfortunately, that's not possible. So usually you would use a maps ID annotation on your association to tell Hibernate that the primary key of the parent entity is also part of the primary key of the child. Unfortunately, that only works with the entire primary key, not with parts of it. So we can't use that here. The only thing that we can do is we can set these values programmatically. So what you just saw when we talked about surrogate keys and natural keys is that when we persist an entity, the primary key attributes are set after we call the persist method. So what we can do is we can instantiate a parent, we can set the PB attribute and then persist the entity. Then Hibernate will use the UUID generator to set the PA attribute. In the next step, we can then instantiate a child, set the PA, and persist that one as well. And that solves the issue that they had here. So when you're modeling an entity with a composite primary key, please always keep in mind that you need to add all mapping annotations on the entity class, but not on the class. If you want to add mapping annotations to the class that represents the primary key, then you need to use an embedded ID. We don't have time to dive into that here on the stream in great detail, but there's a link here in the article, and you can find a link to that question on thorbenjansen.com/live. So there you can find out more about how to use embedded IDs. And if you reuse the full entity, no, the full primary key of a parent entity on a child, you can do that with maps ID. If not, then you need to do something like this here, where you programmatically set the required parts of the key. Okay. So if you have any questions about this answer that I just showed you, or any other Hibernate question, then this is the right time to ask them. We have about 15 minutes to talk about whatever Hibernate question you have. So feel free to ask. I take another sip of my coffee and just wait a short moment for questions. Yeah, while we are waiting for questions, we can quickly talk about the plan for next week. Let me quickly open up my spreadsheet. So next Friday, 3 p.m. CET, as always, we will do another Coffee with Thorben stream. And the plan for next week is that we talk about, what is it? We will talk about native queries. So if you have any questions about native queries, then yeah, feel free to send them. If you have any other suggestions on what we could talk about on the weekly stream, then post them in the chat or send me an email. I'm more than happy to take suggestions for stream topics, and then yeah, do 15-20 minutes, maybe a little bit more, to introduce a specific topic and share my opinion on it. Okay. Well, it looks like we don't have any questions today, right? So that's a pity, but yeah, we wait a little bit longer and keep talking for a bit more. And then, yeah, if you don't have any questions, then we can just sum it up, and we see us again next Friday. Let's see. So while we are waiting for a few more questions, we could take a look at this week's article for a bit. So with Spring Boot, configuring and integrating Spring Data has become incredibly simple. So you set up your Spring Boot project. The easiest way to do that is the Spring Initializer. And then you add a dependency to the Spring Boot Starter Data JPA module. And that one brings most of all the things that you need. The only thing that's missing is JDBC driver. Because well, Spring doesn't know to which database you want to connect, right? So you just add another dependency to JDBC driver, and then you're actually good to go, especially if you're using an in-memory embedded database. Then Spring Boot starts up that database automatically after it detected the JDBC driver, and you don't have to do anything. If you're using an external database like a PostgreSQL database or an Oracle database, then you need to provide the connection information in your configuration. You can do that in the application properties, and you're good to go. Then you get a default configuration that uses the Hikari connection pool. You get configured Hibernate integration. So if you remember classic Spring, then there you usually implemented a configuration class where you set up the entity manager factory and took care of the transaction management and all these kind of things. And where you no longer need to do that with Spring Data JPA. Now I see there are a few questions in the chat. So yeah, Rodislav, feel free to just post the question in the chat. I will answer it. Then, but I start with Tepco's question, who was first. And he asked, is it okay if a repository method throws exception in order to avoid null pointer exception, for example, or should this logic be located in service method? That entirely depends on that depends on the exception and what causes the exception. If input parameters, for example, if the method was called with null values, for example, then throwing an exception is totally fine. If you are if the database query just returns an empty result, then I usually prefer to return an empty result set on optional instead of throwing an exception and giving the service layer the chance to handle that situation. Because sometimes it can be totally fine that a result is empty, right? And yeah, that depends on a few things. So as long as it's technically wrong, so as soon as you could provide a validation of something and that fails, I would say throwing an exception from a repository is totally fine. If it's because your result set is empty or something similar, then I would try to avoid the exception and handle that within the repository method. Rodislav asks, how do you enable logging of values of the queries? By default, logging will display question marks. I wanted to ask before, but I had to create an account. Okay. Rodislav wouldn't throw exceptions in a repository, yeah, and would go with optional. As I said, if the result is empty, I wouldn't throw an exception. I would return an empty result in some form, an empty collection, an optional, these kind of things. If the method was called in a technically wrong way, let's say you implement a repository method that supposed to return an object by its ID, and you call that method with null, then I would throw an exception. In all other cases, no. In all other cases, I would just return an empty result and let the service layer handle that. Let the service layer decide if it's okay that the result is null or empty. Because that's something that from a technical point of view, I can't decide in a repository. That's something that's use case specific. Okay, let's get to the to Rodislav's question about showing the parameters in the query. Let's see. I'm sure I have something here. Yeah. So here I have a simple query where I provide the ID as a bind parameter value. And what we can do here is we can configure Hibernate's log category org Hibernate type descriptor SQL and set it to trace. And when you then run this this test case, you will see that Hibernate prints out the bind parameters and the extracted parameters for that statement. So up here, it's still the question mark because that's the statement that Hibernate sent to the database. And then you get one line of log output for each bind parameter, and you get one line of log output for each extracted parameter. And the issue here is that this part here, the extracted, gets pretty noisy if you're selecting huge entities, if you're selecting multiple records. You easily have several hundred lines of log output here when you activate that. So because of that, I'm always a little bit careful about activating trace logging for that category. But if you want to see bind parameters that you set on the query, this would be the way to go. So go to your logging configuration and set type descriptor SQL to trace. Another thing you could do is you could use tools like, I think SQL Spy can do that. So all tools that actually monitor the database connection on a lower level. They quite often can replace the bind parameters in the actual query statement. But to be honest, I like this approach here because that clearly shows me that this query correctly works with bind parameters, which is an important thing. It provides better performance, it provides better usability than inline parameters, and the most important reason, it prevents SQL injection vulnerabilities. Like Java agent with APM things. Yeah, some APMs support that as well. Then depends on which one you are using, but there are also some lower level libraries that basically wrap your JDBC driver and monitor everything that's going on that low level. But yeah, I usually use this approach, and that works reasonably well. And as I said, it shows you that in that code, bind parameters are used correctly, which is a good thing as well. Okay. Any more questions? Okay, looks like we don't have a lot of questions today. There is one from Bahut. In microservices with separate DB per service, is it okay to expose surrogate entity key to value objects to be used in associated services via API? Yeah, I think it is. There are always discussions about should you expose a technical primary key or not. No, Gurkirat, I didn't see your question. Did it include a link? The YouTube applies some form of automatic moderation, and it quite often filters posts that contains links automatically, so I don't even see them. Okay, now I see your question. So let me quickly answer Burut's question and then I get back to you. So Burut asked about microservices with separate databases and if it's okay to expose surrogate entity keys. And where you need to expose some form of identifier to other services so that they can either match that to internal information or that they can reference that in API calls and stuff like that. And where there are always discussions if that identifier has to be a business key or if it can be a surrogate key. And to be honest, in most cases, I don't really care. If we don't have a business key, then of course we use a surrogate key. If the business key is horribly complex, then I prefer using a surrogate key. If we have a simple and useful natural or ID or business key, like the ISBN number of a book, well, then by all means, feel free to use that key. All of that works fine. What I think is important is that you don't have any access to databases of other services, that you have mostly asynchronous data replication and calls between your services. So better don't implement any synchronous calls between your services. They cause a lot of dependencies and performance issues. And that you then have a well-defined API where you can request information about a certain business object by ID. And then I personally don't care if it's a business key that exists in the business domain or if it's a surrogate key. Both of that is totally fine. Okay, Gurkirat post. So in case the child primary key becomes PA, PB, CA, CB, then I can use maps ID. That's about the question of the week, right? Let me quickly go there. That means that, oh yeah, exactly. If you have PA and PB as part of your child key, then you can use maps ID. Because then Hibernate would map the parent key as part of this child key, and you could just use maps ID and Hibernate would manage that automatically. And that would work really well. Wrodislav, you can find me on YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn. The easiest way, if you don't want to use Periscope, is to go to torbenjansen.com/live. There's a YouTube video and a link embedded at the top of the post, and then you directly get to the YouTube channel. Okay, what else do we have? Ambrose wrote, I have a third-party implementation that stores some config data within a serialized blob in Oracle. I need to search across that blob, but finding it very slow with JPA Hibernate. Are there any options apart from representing the blob data in database that might improve performance? So the first question there is it slow because of Hibernate, or is it slow because the search operation, so the query itself, is slow? If the query is slow, then we can't do anything in Hibernate. The only thing that you could do in Hibernate is you could use a native query if you're not already doing that. If you're using a native query, then you can use all database features. So yeah, you can easily use everything your database is capable of doing. Because you wrote it's a blob, I'm wondering how the database searches in that blob, because serialized blobs are usually an issue with for search operation because it's just a byte array that's some form of object, some form of serialized object, most likely. So to me, that sounds more like a general issue with the query itself. And yeah, my first recommendation there would be do an explain analyze on that statement, check the performance, see if the performance is faster if you're not selecting it via Hibernate directly with an SQL statement. My first expectation would be that it's about as slow as it is with Hibernate, and then there's nothing we can do about that in Hibernate. So Ambrose wrote, not searchable from database operation. It is deserialized in entity. Okay. Yeah, the only thing that you can do from a Java perspective is that if you don't need to search within that blob, if you're just mapping it, then you can use a lazy fetching approach. Maybe map that with another entity class or annotate it with how's that annotation called? Yeah, with a basic annotation, set the fetch type to lazy and activate bytecode enhancement with lazy fetching. Then Hibernate doesn't fetch the blob until you access it in your code. Okay, now we have a lot of questions. Yeah, let's see that we answer a few of them, and then we end the stream in a few minutes. So Ranga wrote, JPA criteria builder with conjunction and disjunction. The parentheses are not being added as expected. How to ensure that the parentheses added as expected? Well, that's impossible to answer without seeing the code. So yeah, Ranga, my suggestion there is maybe create a Stack Overflow post for that and send me a link to it. Then I'm more than happy to take a look at it and maybe answer it on next week's stream. Let's see. Well, I'm doing these weekly live streams on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Periscope. I'm using a tool called Restream that distributes the stream to all social platforms. But yeah, for videos, my main platform right now is YouTube. So there you can find weekly tutorial videos and also the weekly live streams. And there you can easily access older live streams as well, which on the other platforms is quite often a bit of a hassle to find. So Ranga wrote, it seems to be my questions are being posted to Thorben Jensen, but I can see the question being posted at chat. So I can see your questions, Ranga. I'm not sure what's the issue there. I saw your previous question that I just answered. So it looks like everything seems to be fine. No, Radoslav, I'm live every week on YouTube and on all the other platforms, not just every 4 weeks. I'm live every Friday at 3 p.m. Okay, interesting. So there are some discussions about if every question gets posted or not. That would explain why I didn't see some questions in the beginning. I don't know. So far, it looked like everything worked fine, but I would double check that after the stream. So Ambrose wrote, Spring Quartz framework maintains job data in serialized blob. Yeah. Then you need to. Well, but that job data usually isn't that huge, right? So depending on your entity configuration and everything, you should be able to easily fetch that. JPA and Hibernate, and by that also Spring Data JPA, provide pretty decent support for blobs. The only thing you need to keep in mind is that if you have a huge blob, if you have a video file, for example, then you are selecting a lot of data, which means you put a huge burden on the database, on the network, and then on your business layer to work with that amount of data. That's the only issue that you usually have with blobs. It's data related. If your blob is small, then it works perfectly fine. So Didi asked, will the Spring Data JPA course cover the multi-tenancy issues as well? I'm more or less curious as how to tackle schema and database based. What exactly do you mean by multi-tenancy issues? So what we have with Hibernate is we have multi-tenancy support for separate database and separate schema, and that works reasonably well. And you can of course also use that with Spring Data JPA. Right now, I don't have a chapter about multi-tenancy in that Spring Data JPA course, but if you tell me about the issue you're currently struggling with, I might add it. I mean, there are still a few weeks left until the course goes live, so more than happy to adjust the curriculum there if there is something missing. So let me open up the YouTube video with the live stream in the chat and see how that goes there. Okay, so far it looks like all the questions are also on all platforms. Yeah, that if some questions don't show up in the official chat, then that might be because of YouTube's automatic moderation feature, which sometimes sucks. So Didi wrote, I think Hibernate supports multi-tenancy for both schema and database multi-tenancy, but I think they keep their data sources. But what if you have if you have hundreds of schemas on a few databases? Yeah, then you have an issue. So what Hibernate supports, and that is only what Spring Data can use, is that Hibernate filters or implements the multi-tenancy support on a connection level. That means either when you start a new session and associate the database connection with it, you either switch the connection, the schema in that connection, or you take a different physical connection from some connection pool. These are the two approaches that Hibernate supports there. And that puts you in the uncomfortable situation that you need to maintain hundreds of schemas and distribute them over probably multiple database servers. And that is unfortunately the only support that Hibernate provides there. Multi-tenancy is a complex issue. The Hibernate team solves that to some extent, but there are a lot of things that are out of scope for an OR mapping framework. The OR mapping framework just handles the actual database access. or the operations components, like how do I set up a new database for a new tenant? How do I manage hundreds of schemas? How do I update hundreds of schemas? All these kind of things are out of scope for Hibernate and also for Spring Data JPA. That's something that needs to be solved independently. And yeah, I know it sucks for deployments with lots of tenants. But as of now, I'm not aware of any easy to use or comfortable solution there. All of them run into the same issue. Also, if you use other JPA implementations like Spring Data JPA, for like Eclipse Link, for example, which you could use with Spring Data JPA, but there you run into the same issue. That's just how it is with multi-tenancy. Okay, it's already pretty late. So yeah, sorry for the issues with the chat. I will look into that after today's stream. Maybe I will find a solution for that. Maybe can figure out what has been going on there. And then, yeah, we see each other again, hopefully next Friday, 3 p.m. CET, so at the same time as this week. And I quickly answer Radoslav's message. I see you switched from Periscope to YouTube. And then we end today's stream. So he wrote, when you return an entity via controller, does it make sense to detach it first? No. So first of all, the entity gets detached when you return it via your API. So that happens automatically. And then Didi is right. It's almost always better to use projections for two reasons. First of all, it separates your persistence layer in database schema from your API level. That means you can have full flexibility to adjust both of them without affecting the other one. And then it leaks an implementation detail. The technical domain model and the database schema is basically the definition of an implementation detail. So you wouldn't want to leak that to the client. And then there's the third reason, and that is that for all read operations, DTO projections provide much better performance compared to entities. And you should therefore use DTOs, which you can then design for a specific use case. And where you also avoid the overhead of working with managed entities. But that might be a topic for another stream where we dive into these differences and when to use which approach. So yeah, Radoslav, that's a good approach. Use DTOs most of the time. If you're implementing a small app where code base is small, where number of users is small, and so on. Working with entities is usually a good thing because it speeds up the development process a little bit. And if you don't have a lot of load, and if you don't have a huge application, there isn't much you need to worry about from a refactoring point of view, from a load point of view, from a performance point of view. So there you can do a lot of things that might not be the optimal solution, but which just work in that setting. Okay, then thanks everyone for attending. I hope you enjoyed today's stream. I definitely did. Thanks for all the questions. And I'm looking forward to see you again next week. Take care. And if you want to make sure that you don't miss any of the streams, either head over to the YouTube channel and subscribe there. Then you get a notification ahead of the stream. Or make sure to go to torbenjansen.com/live and join my email list, where I will also tell you about new blog posts, new videos, and all these kind of things. Okay. Take care. Have a great weekend. Bye.